You're listening to the Jōrni Podcast. How can our darkest moments become the catalyst for unexpected strength? Join us for an inspiring story of resilience and transformation through physical challenge. This episode contains adult subject matter, and some listeners may be triggered by this content. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Jōrni Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. This episode explores a powerful journey from the depths of depression to rediscovering purpose and hope. Our guest shares her story of transformation, revealing how she found an unexpected lifeline that gave her a reason to keep going. We delve into the challenges of navigating severe mental health struggles and the pivotal moments that can spark positive change. This conversation highlights the profound impact of discovering something, anything, that keeps you moving forward when everything seems dark. It's a reminder of our capacity to find meaning, purpose, and hope, even in our most difficult times. Ali Robinson is a certified personal trainer and running coach who found solace in running after years of struggling with depression. After surviving a suicide attempt in 2011, she made it her mission to help women and mothers find purpose and passion in life by exploring the goals, challenges, and triumphs that can be experienced when you discover just how far and fast you can go. In 2019, Ali started her business, Something Wonderful, to help educate, inspire, and guide runners to crush their goals. Here is my interview with Ali Robinson. Hi, Ali. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because from survival to strength is such a profound topic for today's episode. And I really look forward to finding out more about your story and sharing that with our listeners. So thank you for coming on today and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. And, this is a topic that I am very passionate about. So anytime I get a chance to have, open conversations, I'm happy to jump on and be here.
Yeah, I really thank you for that. These are some of the more difficult conversations to have, and yet they're really, really important. So let's start us off with a little bit about yourself. Maybe where you consider that your story started, or maybe some of the beginnings of that, so that we can give our listeners an idea of how this all came together and where this started for you. Let's start off with that.
Okay. Well, my name is Ali. I am currently in Miami and I run a business and I'm a running coach. But it wasn't always like that because growing up, I always felt like I had this darkness around me. I feel like I was almost born without the will to live. And I know that sounds a little dramatic, and I wasn't like suicidal as a kid, but I always had this premonition that I wasn't going to grow up and I have no purpose in life. And I just always had that deep feeling of I'm not enough to be a part of this world. And yet I was always this kind of bright, bubbly little kid, right? Like I was the loudest girl in class and I was the shortest girl in class with the biggest personality. And I loved to sing and dance and perform. And from a very young age, I was kind of told like to sit down, to be quiet, right? To conform. And yet I always had this desire to stand out. And yet I was always told I was too loud, I was too much. And that really kind of hurt deep down because I felt like, when I went to try to express myself, it wasn't what people wanted of me. It wasn't what was expected of a young girl. And so as I grew older, my sister was very sick. And so my mom wrapped her life around my little sister. And so I was kind of left taking care of my little brothers while my mom was in the hospital with my little sister or doing around the clock breathing treatments. And my dad worked really hard to provide for the family. And so, kind of having this lack of dreams and desires and goals mixed with the feeling of having to take care of my little brothers and feeling unappreciated and feeling like I had all of this responsibility and not really having parents around, I had the freedom to get into a lot of trouble that young teenagers might not have the opportunity to do. So, very early in life, I started to seek attention and love from places I probably shouldn't have. And so I started to get involved with boys and promiscuous sex and drugs at a very young age. And I hated myself for that. And I loved my family so much. And I wanted to make my parents proud. And I wanted to be that helpful daughter. And I wanted their love and attention. And yet I knew that if they found out about the things that I was doing, that would all be gone. That facade would be shattered. And so I just kept kind of going deeper inside of myself. And I started dressing differently. And I started wearing like big baggy sweatshirts in the middle of the summer. And I just was trying to like hide myself from the world. But a 15-year-old girl can only there can only be so many lies and so much deceit before it all comes to light. And so there were calls home from my school. Police and detectives were getting involved with pictures that were found of me on the internet. And my mom sat me down to have a serious conversation with like, what is going on? And I realized that I could not live with the consequences of my actions. I could not face the fact that some of these things were going to follow me for the rest of my life. My reputation was shattered. My self respect was shattered. My parents' image of me was ruined. And so that is when I knew that I was going to take my life. I didn't know how and I didn't know when, but I knew that I wasn't meant to live. I felt like everything that I felt as a child and growing up was all like just coming together and that I was never meant to grow up. And so when I went to school the next day, I skipped all of my classes, right? I just showed up to say goodbye to my friends in the only way that I knew how without giving my plan away. I said goodbye to my teachers. But with skipping a bunch of my classes that I was already failing, they called my mom and said, she's skipping school. And my mom came and was furious and was like, that's it. You're done. We're taking you out of school. Like, you're done. And what she didn't realize is that I had no plans of going back to school anyways. And so the next day, my dad woke me up early in the morning and wanted to take me to the grocery store, which I knew already that they were just trying to keep an eye on me, making sure I wasn't going to get into any more trouble than I already was. And as we were at the grocery store, we were getting things to make breakfast for the family and making French toast. And I just was thinking like, wow, like that sounds like a really good final meal. Like breakfast with my family, some French toast, that's delicious. And as we were at the checkout line, at least here in the States, by the checkout line, there's like candy and stuff by the register. And there were some mint patties that were by the register. And I was just thinking, like, gosh, like, there's not much in this life that I'm going to miss, but I am going to miss mint patties. And so I said like, hey, Dad, can I have this? And he said, yeah, sure, kid. And so on the drive home, I was eating this mint chocolate and I just like started crying because I realized that this might be the last sweet treat that I ever have. And I think that's what it was dawning on me. Like, this is real. Like, this is happening. And so I went home, I had breakfast with my family, And then I gave my siblings all the love that I could. And they probably caught on to more red flags than even my parents did, because while I loved my siblings, I definitely wasn't going out of my way to spend time with them outside of my sisterly duties. But I gave them all the love that I could. And I want you to understand, this part might sound a little silly, but I want you to really understand what was going on in my 15-year-old mind. But I went into my room and I did my makeup and I did my hair. And I just thought that the next morning when my parents found me dead, it would be less shocking to them if I looked beautiful or peaceful. And so I did up my makeup and I felt so pretty when I looked in the mirror. And at dinner that night, my mom even commented that I looked like just a porcelain doll. And that night I laid in bed and I was thinking about like what I had to do. Like it was almost a checklist of like, okay, I'm going to do this and then this and then this, and this is all how it's going to work out. And I did that as a way to keep the other thoughts out of my head, to not think about the fact that like, who's going to find my body? Is it going to hurt? Right? Anytime those thoughts popped into my head, I pushed them out and said, no, like, this is the best thing for your family. Like, your mom is already dealing with enough stress. She doesn't need you to come and keep messing things up for the family. Everyone is going to be better off when you are gone. And I just kept reminding myself that, and that kind of gave me the courage to follow through with my plan. And so when everybody was asleep, I went into the kitchen and I counted out a bunch of pills and I put them all in my mouth. And immediately I gagged, right? You can't swallow two handfuls of pills all at once. And so, in fear of vomiting or it not working, I spit them all out. And then I did the most painstaking thing of taking all of the pills one by one by one. And each time I took a new pill, it was even scarier. But I also grew more confident that this was the best decision. And I went to sleep. And I was perfectly content that I was never going to wake up again. But I wouldn't be here if I didn't make it. So 4 days later, I woke up after suffering cardiac arrest. My parents found me the next morning. I was unresponsive. I was foaming at the mouth and I had urinated on myself. So much for trying to look beautiful and peaceful in death. But they told me, I was lucky to be a 15-year-old healthy girl, or I would not have survived. And I just remember thinking in the hospital, like, don't they understand that I don't want to be here? Like, waking up in the hospital 4 days later was literally the worst case scenario in that situation. And they kept reiterating, like, you're so lucky. I know that you are going to deal with challenges, but you are so lucky to be alive right now. And I just remember being furious with the doctor, like, you don't understand. After I woke up in the hospital, they immediately wanted to transfer me to a behavioral health unit. And I don't think they quite understood the extent of the medical consequences of my actions, because I was suffering some neurological damage from my incident. And so I couldn't walk. I went from a healthy 15-year-old girl that did ballet to not being able to walk. And so when they took me to the behavioral health unit, they brought me a walker. And so for the first time in days, I had to grab onto the walker and lift myself up with two strangers on either side of me, ushering me down this hall and into the behavioral health unit. And every step was excruciating. Like, my arms were shaking. I was still wearing like my hospital gown and hospital socks. And each step, like, I just started bawling and I wanted to just sit down. I wanted to lay down. I wanted to die. And yet every time I asked the nurses around me, like, can I just take a break? They kept saying, like, no, you have to keep going. You have to go get in bed at the behavioral health unit. And I just was, this was the hardest thing. Like, this felt like a punishment for living was being forced to walk down this long green hallway. But I went through the behavioral health unit and I ended up getting stronger and I was able to walk and I was able to slowly return to my normal self. And while I was at the behavioral health unit, I realized if I'm not going to die, then I might as well just get the heck out of here, because living in a behavioral health unit and getting Jello and team building games and karaoke is definitely not my idea of a good life. And so I asked them, how do I get out of here? And they're like, oh, well, there's a man that's going to come in and you need to talk to him and he's going to sign off on whether you can leave or not. And so I was like, okay, I got this. And I went in there with a plan and I was like, look, I didn't die, so I have to start living. My mom needs me. My siblings need me. I need to get out of here because there's people that need me if I'm not going to die. And he was like, okay, I'll see you back here in a couple more days. And I was like, what the heck? Why? I went in there so confident. Why isn't he letting me out of this, this literally nut house, right? Why am I stuck in the psych ward? And so one of the kids in the ward that I had befriended was like, look, I'm getting out tomorrow. Let me tell you what the secret is. And he's like, you have to go in there and talk to the big man. And you have to tell him what your dreams are, what your desires are, and what you're going to do when you leave this facility. And I was like, boom, perfect. So a couple days later, I went in and I said, look, I am so excited for life. I am going to be a dancer. I am going to graduate high school. I am going to live all of these beautiful, amazing dreams. And guess what? Those lies allowed me to go home. And so I figured out the secret to the mental health world. You just lie. You be exactly what they want you to be. You say the right things, you do the right things, and then you get to get out of psych wards, you get to graduate from therapy, and nobody has to know that anything is going on inside. And so I just got better at suppressing that darkness. And it was shoved down my throat that suicide was not an option. But if suicide is not an option and you still don't want to live, then what? And so for many years, I lived on autopilot, no dreams, no desires, and full of lies, doing exactly what everyone wanted me to do, doing what I thought that I should be doing. I said the right things. I did the right things. And I was miserable. And so those thoughts of suicide kept coming back in, right? And at first it was just little thoughts here and there, oh, well, what if I just stepped off the curb and a car hit me? Or what if I started swimming into the ocean until my arms and legs gave out and I drowned? But then I realized that I was fantasizing more about death than I was life. And there was a point where I was sitting on the kitchen floor, desperate for a reason to live. And I was scrolling on my phone and I came across an ad for the Miami Marathon. And it popped into my head, a marathon? Running 26.2 miles? My dad ran marathons when I was younger. He got a medal for running a marathon. I could get a medal. Because now as a mother, there is no award for waking up with a baby in the middle of the night. There's no award for most loads of laundry done or making dinner for your family every night. But I could run a marathon and I could get a medal as acknowledgement that I did something really hard. And so I said, okay, I cannot fall victim to the darkness until I run that marathon. I cannot kill myself until I run that marathon, because if I'm going to leave this earth, I'm going to do it with an award, with a medal, and to show everyone that I can do hard things. And so I started training. Not very well. I knew nothing about running. I made all the mistakes. I got injured, but I kept pushing through because this is the goal that was keeping me alive. This was my lifeline. And so I kept training. And I was very, very, very injured going into that marathon. But no matter how much my leg hurt, I was not going to stop until I crossed that finish line. So I showed up at the race, and in the beginning, they sing like the national anthem before the race. And it was just that moment of like, this is the moment that's kept me alive for the last year. And I just felt like, okay, if I can get to that finish line, I know that my entire life is going to change. Like at that moment, I knew that my life would be saved if I could just finish. And so the race started. And it was much more of a limp than a run, but I kept pushing through. And I ended up seeing my husband at mile 22. And I fell into his arms and I cried. And I just said, like, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. Like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever done. Like, this is not fun. And I kind of was hoping that he would just say, like, Allie, it's okay to quit. Like, Allie, come home with me. Like, get in the car. Let's just drive home. This is dumb. And he didn't. He just like dried my tears and said, like, okay, I'll see you at the finish line. And so I started walking away from my husband, well, limping away from my husband. And I knew that I had made a mistake. Like I was in so much pain. My leg has seized up. I couldn't hardly move. And I was just crying. Like I wanted to quit. I wanted someone to give me permission to quit. But my whole life, people told me quitting was not an option. And I started to think about that green hallway. And I started thinking about asking those nurses if I could just sit down and take a break. And they were saying, no, like you have to keep going. Even though I was shaking and struggling, they kept making me go forward. And I was like, wow, I am at mile 23 of a marathon and there's no one around me to tell me what to do. And so I sat on the curb and I cried. And I realized I could quit. I could walk away from the marathon and I don't think anybody would blame me, right? Nobody would be like, well, you're a failure. You didn't do it. If anything, my friends and family would be like, you know what? Awesome for even attempting it, right? Congratulations. Nobody would be mad if I quit. And I could quit right then. But as I sat on the curb and I thought about it more, I realized that I know what it's like to quit. I know what it's like to quit on life. And I want to see my son grow up. And I want to grow old with my husband. And I don't ever want to feel that way again. I want to keep going. And so the most powerful thing that I have ever come to do is stand up from that curb and realize that quitting is always an option. But there is power in choosing to keep going. And so I gritted my teeth and I ran to the finish line and I threw my arms out and I crossed the barrier, making me an official marathon runner. And they put that medal around my neck. And for the first time in my life, I was proud of myself because I made a goal and I chased after it. And I realized that this was what life was about. It wasn't doing what other people told you to do. It was taking something that you were passionate about and going forward with it full force. Even if there's mistakes, even if it's hard, it's choosing to keep moving forward. And so from there, I realized that this is what I wanted to make my life about. I actually learned more about running, right? I actually had to go back and re-educate myself, fix all the mistakes that I made. And I realized that, this is how I can empower other women. I can take women that maybe like hated running the mile at school, right? Who hated running as a kid, who hates running as an adult. And I can help them find empowerment and strength and to help them reach their own goals, to find their own dreams and their own passions outside of motherhood or their career and to find life. So I know that was a very long story, but that's how I got here. That's how I became a running coach. It wasn't a pretty start.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that story with us. And thank you for being so open and honest about what happened to you and what you were thinking at the time and going through, because those are difficult things to talk about and possibly to think back on. and repeat them now for our listeners to be part of. So thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing that. You know, that was a lot for you to shoulder as a young girl, and to take responsibility within your family, and to have to deal with all of that while you're supposed to be a kid having fun growing up. That was a lot to go through. And I'm very glad that you're still here with us today, telling us about that, and that you are moving forward with a passion and a purpose now that you have found. Is there a part of you that sometimes thinks back and thinks about what happened to put you in that situation, to want to take your own life? Was that a lack of purpose or a lack of confidence in yourself to some part? Was it a coping mechanism for what was going on at the time? Or how did you end up in that place where you thought that was your only option? You did touch about, that haunting you for the rest of your life, the actions that you had taken at that time as well. But I'm trying to understand, what was the part that really in the end you were like, okay, I need to do it this way. It's my only option. Was it because that would haunt you? Was it because you felt like you had no place somewhere where you weren't able to cope with those things on an emotional or physical level? How did that come together for you?
Well, I think it was a mishmash of a lot of things, right? And you look at the statistics of suicide, right? And there are so many reasons why people commit suicide, whether it's abusive relationships with parents or spouses, right? Whether it's financial difficulties, drugs, lack of self-worth, discrimination, so many different things across so many different cultures and so many different, levels. And it all comes down to one thing, right? Across the board, it comes down to hope, right? It's when we lose hope that things will ever get better. It comes down to the fact that we don't think that there is a life worth living tomorrow. And so that is why suicide is so prevalent in teenagers and young people, because as an adult, we've lived through experiences that are hard, right? We know that even if we can't find the solution today, we might find the solution tomorrow. And as adults, we learn how quickly life can change. We know that we can quit a job or get a new job or leave a spouse or move across the country for a new start. We could, find a new hobby or meet a best friend, right? We see how quickly life can change. But as a teenager, you are confined to your social group, your school, your parents, right? And the 1, 2, 3, 5 years until you turn 18 and have that level of freedom, it can seem like a lifetime. And so I understand why so many teenagers turn to suicide, because it's that lack of hope. It's that lack of knowing that tomorrow could be better, because our worlds as teenagers are so small. And so while I speak out actively against, suicide prevention and awareness for everybody, I definitely have a soft spot for teenagers, because what they need is hope. And I wish I would have had someone when I was 15 years old to be like, hey, I know this sucks. I know you've messed up. I know you've made mistakes. I know that you're shouldering a lot of responsibility. But guess what? 10 years from now, you're going to be married with a husband that absolutely adores you and kids that are absolutely amazing and funny and talented. And you are going to find a hobby that makes you want to get out of bed. And you're going to have a career that you love. I wish, even if it wasn't my future self telling me that, I wish I just had another woman to say, I know how you felt, and look at me on the other side. And so what led to my suicide attempt is a mishmash of things. But it comes down to a lack of hope. And that's something that we can instill in everybody and the young people in the world.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I feel like the mental health system, I mean, you learned how to play it, if we can term it that, but I feel like you didn't get the support that you needed or the help that you needed from that system or that particular place or those professionals. So how did that impact your relationships going forward? I would imagine that an experience like that impacts your entire family. I mean, first of all, your parents who found you and then had to decide what to do, decide what to tell your siblings. And then, of course, with you being in the hospital after, explain what is happening to some degree. So how did that impact the relationships around you, your close friends, your family? And where did you find the strength or the resilience to actually keep going with that and to be part of those relationships still going forward, even though you had this very, very difficult experience that I'm not sure anyone else that hasn't gone through it can really, truly understand?
So that's the thing, is that my relationship with my parents was incredibly damaged, right? Like, they saw me as this perfect little teenager that was so happy and so helpful. And when I came home from the behavioral health unit, they treated me like a breakable egg. And so they walked on eggshells around me, and they wanted to spend more time as a family. And if my family wasn't already my world before my suicide attempt, they were determined to be my entire universe after my attempt. And so they pulled me out of school. I wasn't allowed to speak to any of my old friends. They even monitored, like, I wasn't allowed to have social media or access to computers. And I was even like restricted on what type of music I was allowed to listen to. And they said that it was just so that I could heal without distraction. But what I really felt like they were trying to do is put me back into that mold that they knew before everything fell apart. Right. They just wanted the happy, helpful daughter back. And so, from what I learned in the behavioral health unit, right, I played the part, right, because I didn't want to get into any more trouble. Right. So, I just did what they wanted me to do. And yet, they tried to spend more time with me, but the damage was already done because I was so resentful. And I still helped out. I still took care of my siblings, but instead of this desire to be helpful, it was just kind of an empty obligation that I kind of lived with. And so I feel like in those teenage years, 15, 16, 17, even at 18 years old, while most teenagers are discovering who they are, what their passions are, what they want to do with their life, I was kind of taking care of my family and just kind of in survival mode and just trying to keep my parents happy so I didn't get into any more trouble.
Yeah, that sounds like such a difficult, difficult time, even as a family, to go through. Looking back as your adult self at that time and those years, what would you have found helpful during that time? What would you have wished for that you would have considered supportive or helpful or encouraging in that time?
I would have wanted my parents to get to know me, right? Who is Allie? What does Allie want? Because I didn't know. I didn't know what I wanted, right? Like, I didn't even know that I was going to live past 10, 12, 15 years old, right? Like, each day I was surprised to wake up. And so I wish they would have just taken the time to figure out who Allie is. What does she like? Like, honestly, like, I don't even know that my parents could have told me what my favorite color was because they were just so obsessed with kind of fitting me into their mold that they didn't realize who I was actually as a person. And so I wish that I would have had someone come down onto my level and explore who I am, right? Like, let's try 100 different hobbies and see if one sticks, right? Let's go out and explore different things and just see what you like or what you don't like. Like, who are you? What do you stand for? What do you stand against? Like, you don't know unless you go out and do it. And I heard a quote once that was like, in life, we have to just run 100 miles in the wrong direction. And I was like, what the heck does that even mean? Who wants to get stranded in the middle of nowhere after running 100 miles? And I realized that there is just such a sense of power in figuring out who you are and where you want to go. And it doesn't even matter if you're going in the right direction as long as you're moving forward. And so I just wish that they would have helped me. So like maybe I would have found running as a hobby years before if I wouldn't have just been confined to my house and my family and would have been given more freedom to explore the world and to help me discover what I actually wanted in life.
Yeah, that's some great wisdom looking back on that. And to any listeners who are in that situation, maybe as a parent or maybe also in your situation, how do you ask for that in your situation when you're being put in a mold and you're feeling like you're not being heard and seen? How do you ask for that in that situation to get that support?
That's the first question that you've asked me that I don't know the answer to, right? Because, as someone that's not a doctor or a therapist, I can only speak from my situation, right? In my past. And I didn't ask for that support. And so I lived for years miserable, right? And so the only thing that I can say is that bringing awareness, right? Bringing awareness to therapists and counselors and teachers and parents and to help people identify maybe some of these teenagers that are feeling this way, or to maybe bring awareness to parents of like, hey, we like our job as parents is to not mold perfect people, right? Our job as parents is to help these new people in the world, this new generation, find their own path, right? They can't walk in our shoes. They can't walk in our footprints. They have to make their own path. They have to make their own footprints in the sand. And so I think by me talking about it, we can bring that awareness out. And if any young person hears my story, I hope they realize that while you are under the control of your parents, while you trying to go out and explore yourself may get you into more trouble now, know that this does not last forever. And while it might be 3, 4, 5 years until you turn 18, it's not a lifetime. And there is so much more beauty to explore and find in the world that you're never going to be able to see unless you choose to hold on and to get through these difficult years. Because if I would have given up or if I would have tried again, there's so much beauty in my life that I wouldn't have been able to see and do and experience. And so all I can tell you is that as a teenager, you don't have control. And if you can ask for help, more power to you, right? I sure didn't have that strength. But now by hearing this, maybe you will. And I hope that you do. But if it goes on deaf ears where people don't understand how you're feeling, I just hope that you have hope, that there is so much more beauty to experience.
Yeah, thank you for that. And definitely a lot of food for thought, I think also for parents and for teenagers there. With you being a mom now too, right? You have those insights now that you bring forward from your own teenage years to that as well. So that changes the dynamic a little bit as well. Now, moving forward with these experiences that you have now, how do you work with clients now? You're a running coach, and that's a big part of your own story. So, how do you work with and support clients now? How has this experience that you had as a teenager come forward and sort of mixed into what you do today?
Well, I think it's funny because I didn't ever tell my story, right? Like this happened when I was 15. I'm 29 now. And I didn't tell my story for 15 years, ever, never once, right? And it wasn't until just literally a couple months ago that I started to tell my story because I had this idea that if clients knew my past, they were going to judge me. They would think that if I've struggled with mental health, how am I going to support them in their dreams and their goals? And so I hid it. I didn't tell anybody. I was just this happy cheerleader. I was masking, right? I was masking and lying and not being my true authentic self, just as I had done my whole life, right? And so I had someone approach me and ask me to tell my story because they knew me as a young girl and they knew the things that I had gone through. And I was like, I am not telling my story. I am not telling a story about a depressed teenage girl that took a handful of pills and tried to kill herself. And he said, no, like, this is not a story about a depressed teenage girl that tried to commit suicide. This is a story of how you found life. And so, it still took me a little while to tell my story after that, but it kept circling in my head of like a story about life, a story about life. And so one day I was running a race and I was like 30 miles into a race and I was just in so much pain and it was so hard and I would just remember like even though I was literally crying in pain because it was so painful to like do this ridiculously hard race. I just remember being so grateful that I was still alive and that how I was able to go through these hard races and do these hard things because of my past. I thought about that green hallway. I thought about surviving everything that I had already gone through. And that gave me the strength and the courage to push through. And I ended up like winning this race. And so I had that light bulb moment of like, oh my gosh, my clients need to hear this. I am doing a disservice by not telling them these things. I am doing them a disservice by not talking about my past experiences and how that has made me stronger. And so, literally, just in the last couple months, I have started to open up about my story and tell my clients about my struggles. And you know what? They didn't meet me with pitchforks. They didn't run away screaming. They didn't judge me. They didn't say that I was a terrible person. They said, wow, I relate so much to your story. They shared with me their own struggles with mental health or abusive relationships or struggle with drug addiction or alcoholism. They shared those things and it made us connect on a deeper level. And when women, especially women, I guess all people, but especially women, when we can connect on a deeper level, not just a superficial layer of like, my name is Allie, I'm a running coach, and I'm going to be your biggest fan, right? But on a deeper level, I can help my clients so much more. They can dig deep and achieve so much more when they have that deep connection with the people that are helping them along the way. And so it took me a long time to learn this lesson, right? But our hardest moments are what are our strengths now. And it's not those hard moments. It's not the trauma, right? Trauma, like they say, like, oh, the hard things make you harder, right? No, trauma is traumatic, right? It's not the trauma that makes you stronger. It's the fact that you've overcome it and everything that you've done to get to the point where you are today, that is your strength. And that is what gets you to the end of a marathon when you're crying at mile 23. That's what gets you up and over the mountain when your calves are cramping at mile 30 of a race. That's what gets you to figure out the financial difficulties or the hardships of motherhood because you can do hard things. And so that's kind of how I help my clients, at least using my past experience.
Yeah. I feel that fear that keeps us from speaking out about pieces of ourselves that might be what we consider dark or something bad that happened in the past, we are still then denying our authentic self because these pieces are part of who we are. They've shaped us. They've made us, like you said, as strong as we are today. So I am glad that you're speaking about this, that you're sharing this with your clients, because we get to see the full, authentic Allie and all of that. And it's absolutely beautiful and an inspiration. And like you said, it gives hope that we can work through and overcome the challenges that we face and find that inner strength and that hope that we may have been missing for some time in life. So yeah, I think this is a huge part of the healing and of moving forward as well. So you've also written a book. Is it about your past experiences or?
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. Tell our listeners about what you've written about and the title as well so that they can find it. We'll, of course, put all of that in the show notes later, but just so they can hear from you what this exciting project is all about.
So my book is called The Endless Race, Finding Something Wonderful in a World with No Finish Line. And, I kind of picked this title of Running the Endless Race because I always felt like there was like a timeline on my life. And As a runner, you can have all these dreams and goals and desires, but in life, there is no like end point, right? Like when you finish a marathon, they put the medal around your neck and like boom, you win, right? You're victorious and everything is wonderful. But like in life, there is no finish line. There is no medal. There is no end point where they're like, yeah, you've made it, right? And so in life, we have to slow down and live in those moments and to look back and see how far we've come, because at any given moment, like that is your finish line, right? Like that is the moment where you look back and go, dang, look at how much I've achieved and how much I've done. And you know what? You pick a goal, you achieve that goal, and then guess what? You keep going. Right? There is no finish line. This is an endless race where we get to keep discovering who we are. We get to keep creating who we are. We get to create what we want to do with our life, and we get to define our purpose each and every day. And so I was able to, share my story in the book, which honestly was so healing and so difficult to do. But I hope that people read it and then take into their own life that idea that they can be whoever they want, right? For me, that challenge is running. But the book, while it is a little bit about running, right? I hope that people understand that they can start their own race and whatever that looks like for them. And so my book comes out next week. I'm of course talking in the past. So right now my book is probably out and you can read a little bit more of an in-depth story. Of course, I've given you guys a little clip of my story today, but if you want a more in-depth version of the story or to learn more about me or my philosophies on how to choose to keep moving forward, you can always check out my book, Running the Endless Race.
Amazing. And of course, we will be linking to that in the show notes. And you also have a podcast called the Something Wonderful Podcast. Now, do you talk about what goes into this motivation and passion that you have, or do you mostly keep to running on the podcast? What's your podcast about?
I talk about everything, right? And so one of the big things that I say, like even in my introduction of the podcast is like, I'm like, we'll talk about all things running, racing, strength training, weight loss, without forgetting the real talk, like mental health and motherhood, because I feel like we're doing a disservice of talking about something like running without talking about the fact that we are still humans and we still have to live life. And, we can't just talk about winning races and being the strongest, fastest version of ourselves without realizing all the things that actually make us who we are. So mental health, motherhood, finding the will to live, like all of that encompasses us. We are not just one thing. And so my podcast goes through lots of different topics.
Amazing. And how can people work with you? So you're a running coach. What kind of formats does that coaching take? Do you have to be physically in the same vicinity as you to actually physically run, or can you help people online as well? What does that look like if people would like to work with you?
Yeah. So I primarily now I work with women online. And so I used to really feel like you had to be in person to do everything. But, one of the benefits of COVID is it's given us the ability to connect with people all over the world, all over the country. And so I work with women primarily online. And, it's starting with where people are at. Right? I'm not the kind of coach that's just like, here's your templated format, go do that. I like working with women one-on-one and getting to get to know them and their goals and their dreams and their desires and really helping them along the way, not just to get stronger and faster, but to help them overcome all the things going on in life and to help them feel more confident in the skin that they are in. And so I have group programs. I have a free Facebook group called Weight Loss for Runners. And I work with women one-on-one. All of that information is on my website, somethingwonderful.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that. And as I said, we of course will be linking to all of Ali's offerings in the show notes as well. So be sure to check there on how you can connect with her, how you could work with her, where you can find her book and listen into her podcast. And if you do end up working with Ali, or you end up buying her book and reading that and using some of that in your life, let us know. Connect with us on Instagram and let me know how all that worked out for you. I'm always curious to find out our listeners' experiences when they connect with our guests, and the magic happens from there. So definitely let us know what you're finding. And Ali, I just want to thank you again for being here today as we close out this episode. It has been an absolute privilege to speak with you and to listen to your story and share that with our audience. I absolutely, truly appreciate your openness to share that. And even though it's only been a few months, I'm really glad that you are sharing that, because I feel like so many people can connect with that, might be in the same situation or were in the same situation as you were in as a teenager. And this is something that they can understand and maybe hear those words that you said, that there is hope, and that might make the difference in their lives. So thank you so very much for being here today and for sharing your story. I truly appreciate you and the time that you've given us today.
Thank you for having me. And, I hope that everyone listening just understands how special they are and that they get to create the life that they want to live.
Yeah, absolutely. And please, please listen to those words, because especially when we are teenagers, it's sometimes really hard to hear those or understand those. So on that note, thank you, Ali. Take really great care of yourself, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Jōrni Podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Jōrni on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejorni.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.